You think because you fix engines, you know something about strength. Mason Cole's voice cut through the garage like a blade. He was standing over Morgine's younger brother, one hand gripping the boy's collar, the other pointing a finger inches from Rachel's face. I've got a black belt, sweetheart. I've got trophies. I've got a father who owns half this town. What do you have? Rachel looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were still covered in grease. Her voice was completely calm. More than you want to find out. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next is something Red Valley, Arizona, will never stop talking about. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning it started, Rachel Morgan had been underneath a 1987 Harley-Davidson Sportster for 3 hours. Not because it was a complicated job. The carburetor rebuild was straightforward, she had done it 100 times. But the bike belonged to old Pete Delgado, a 73-year-old Korean War veteran who drove 40 miles every Sunday to visit his wife's grave. And Pete hadn't been able to afford a repair shop, quote, in 2 years. So Rachel had told him to bring it in. No charge, just coffee. Pete sat in the plastic chair near her workbench, nursing a paper cup, watching her work and talking about his wife the way old men do when they think no one is really listening. Rachel was always listening. That was the thing about her. The people who passed her shop every day, the ones who saw a small blonde woman in overalls with motor oil on her forearms and a ponytail coming loose from its tie, they saw exactly what she wanted them to see. A mechanic, a quiet woman, a neighbor who showed up at community fundraisers, brought food when someone's family was in the hospital, and never once raised her voice in public. She had spent years perfecting that image. It was not fake. It was just incomplete. Rachel. Her younger brother Danny appeared in the open bay doorway. Danny was 24, lanky, with their mother's dark eyes and their father's stubborn jaw. He did odd jobs around the shop and studied business at the community college 2 towns over. He was a good kid, a careful kid, but his voice right now was not careful. You need to come out front. She felt it before she saw it. The shift in his breathing. The way he stood slightly sideways, like he was bracing for something. She slid out from under the Sportster, sat up on the creeper, and looked at him. What happened? That guy, Danny said. The Cole kid. He's out front with his people. Rachel reached for the rag, hanging from her belt loop, and wiped her hands slowly. How many? 4 of them. Maybe 5. Pete had gone very quiet in his plastic chair. Rachel stood up and pulled her hair tie out, smoothed it back, and tied it again. It was a small gesture, a habit, something she did when she was organizing her thoughts rather than her appearance. Stay here with Pete, she said. Rachel, Danny. Her voice didn't rise. It never did. Stay here. Mason Cole was 23 years old, and he had never once in his life been told no by someone who meant it. His father, Gerald Cole, had made his money in commercial real estate, the aggressive, swallowing kind, where you identified something a community needed and then purchased the land around it until the community had no choice but to deal with you. Gerald Cole had come to Red Valley 8 months ago, and in those 8 months, he had quietly acquired 3 parcels of land on the eastern edge of town, including the strip of road that ran alongside Rachel Morgan's motorcycle shop. That land purchase was the beginning of everything. Mason had started showing up around the same time. At first, it was just Presence expensive truck, loud exhaust, parking where he wasn't supposed to. Then it was words, comments to the customers who walked past the shop. Heard that mechanic overcharges. Heard the work isn't reliable. Small poison, dripped slowly. Then last week, Mason's crew had started blocking the access road during peak hours. Nothing technical. No signs. No official action. Just 4 or 5 trucks parked in a way that made it difficult, then inconvenient, then genuinely hard for customers to reach the bay entrance. Rachel had not responded. She had not called the sheriff. She had not posted on social media. She had simply found alternate parking solutions for her customers and continued working. People who knew her history understood why she was being so careful. People who didn't know her history mistook that carefulness for fear. Mason Cole was firmly in the second category. So that Tuesday morning, when a customer's named Dave Ritter tried to bring his Indian Scout through the access road and found Mason's crew parked across it again, Dave had gotten out of his truck and asked them, politely, to move. Mason had walked over and called Dave something ugly. Dave, who was 61 years old and had a bad hip, had not responded physically, but Danny had seen it happen from the doorway, and Danny had walked out to the road to say something. That was when Mason had grabbed Danny by the collar, and that was when Rachel came outside. She saw it from 20 feet away. Danny's face was red, not from shame, but from restraint, the look of someone physically controlling the urge to respond. Mason had one hand bunched in the fabric of Danny's shirt, and he was talking loudly, performing for his 4 friends who stood in a loose arc behind him, arms crossed, grinning. Rachel walked at her regular pace, not slow, not fast. She crossed the gravel lot without rushing, and she stopped about 6 feet from Mason. "Let go of my brother," she said. Mason turned to look at her. He registered her size, her age, her gender, her work clothes, and he made all of his calculations in about 2 seconds. He let go of Danny, not because she'd scared him, because he wanted to deal with her directly. This was more interesting. "You the owner?" he said. "I am." "Good." He spread his hands like he was being reasonable. "Then maybe you and I can have a real conversation. Because your brother here doesn't seem to understand how things work." "I understand exactly how things work," Rachel said. "Your father bought the land next to mine. That doesn't give you the right to block my access road." "Funny, because our legal team says different. Your legal team is wrong." Mason stepped closer. Not to her. Past her, almost moving in a half circle, the way a man does when he wants to demonstrate that a woman is not the one who controls the geometry of the situation. It was a dominance move, practiced and deliberate. "You know what I find interesting?" he said. "You've got a nice little setup here. Community mechanic, helps the old folks, real salt of the earth thing." He paused. "But businesses like this don't survive when the neighborhood changes. And this neighborhood is changing." "Is that a threat?" Danny said from behind Rachel. "It's an observation," Mason said pleasantly. Rachel watched him the way a person watches water waiting to see which way it runs. "I'm going to ask you to leave my property," she said. "If you have a legal dispute, take it to the county. I'll see you in court." Mason stopped moving. He turned to face her fully. The pleasant expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "You don't know who you're talking to," he said. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Rachel said. "You're a boy whose father bought him a belt." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. One of Mason's friends, big guy, tattoo on his neck, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Mason heard it. That was the problem. The audience had heard it. "Excuse me," Mason said. "I didn't stutter," Rachel said. What happened next was not planned. Or rather, it was the kind of thing that happens when a person has spent 23 years operating on pure reaction and zero consequence. Mason put his hand on Rachel's shoulder. It was not a gentle gesture. It was meant to move her, to redirect her, to physically demonstrate that he was done with the conversation and she was being repositioned. Rachel moved with it. That was the strange thing that people watching would describe later. She didn't resist. She moved with the pressure of his hand, just slightly off the line of it, and somehow, in that small deflection, Mason's arm came across his own body at a strange angle, and he had to take a step sideways to correct his balance. Nothing dramatic, no throw, no strike. She had simply not been where he tried to put her. "Don't touch me," she said. Mason recovered his balance, and the pleasant expression was gone entirely now. "What do you think you just did?" he said. "Told you not to touch me." He stepped back and looked at her with something new in his face, not anger. Exactly, but a cold reassessment. He was recalculating. "You think you know how to fight," he said slowly. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned to his friends. Then he turned back to her. Something had clicked into place in his mind, some idea he was visibly enjoying before he even spoke it. "You want to settle this?" he said. "Really settle it? Then fight me." The word landed in the air and sat there. Dave Ritter, standing near his truck, went completely still. Even the afternoon wind seemed to pause. "I'm not going to fight you," Rachel said. "Afraid?" "No, then what? You got principles?" He said the word like it tasted bad. "Because from where I'm standing, the principled thing would be to stop hiding behind your legal threats and your little community reputation and just admit you've got no actual answer for me." "Mason." One of his friends said his name quietly. A small warning. Mason didn't hear it, or he heard it and chose not to. "You want me to stop blocking your road?" he said. "You want my father to leave your little garage alone? Then meet me at the gathering. Saturday. Town center. In front of everyone." He paused. "Unless you'd rather just sell." Rachel looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Danny, who had gone completely pale. Then she looked at Dave Ritter, who was 61 years old with a bad hip and had tried to come get his motorcycle fixed and ended up watching this instead. "I'll be there," she said. Danny waited until the trucks had rolled away before he grabbed her arm. "Rachel, you can't be serious." "I'm serious. He's black belt. He trains every day. Danny. He's 23 and he's trained in Danny." She turned to look at him. "Go check on Pete's coffee. He's been sitting in there alone for 20 minutes. This isn't his coffee." Danny stared at her. His jaw was tight, his eyes too bright. He went inside. Rachel stood in the gravel lot in the afternoon heat and listened to the sound of the town settling back into its ordinary rhythm. A dog barking somewhere, a truck on the highway a mile off, the distant sound of a radio from someone's open window. She pulled out her phone and typed one text message. It went to a contact listed only as Viet said, "Saturday. Town gathering. I need you to know." The response came back in 40 seconds. "We'll be there." Rachel put the phone back in her pocket and went inside to finish Pete's carburetor. The talk spread through Red Valley before sunset. That was the nature of small towns. The information moved along its own infrastructure, faster than anyone planned or wanted, following paths built from years of community gossip, barber shop conversation, diner counter-exchange, and the particular efficiency of people who had known each other long enough to communicate in shorthand. By 6 o'clock, the story had already mutated. Version 1, which circulated among Mason's extended social circle, was simple and favorable. The arrogant mechanic had mouthed off to Mason Cole, and he had put her in her place by offering to settle it properly. Good-natured, really. Sportsmanlike. Version 2, which circulated among the older residents and the motorcycle community, was less favorable to Mason. The Cole boy had grabbed Danny Morgan, and when Rachel had come out to defend her brother, he'd escalated it into a public challenge because she'd embarrassed him in front of his people. Version 3 came from Dave Ritter, who had watched the whole thing from 12 feet away and told it exactly as it happened, which somehow made it sound stranger than either of the other versions. "She just moved," Dave told people. "Not like a fight. Like water. He put his hand on her and she just wasn't there anymore, and he stumbled." Nobody knew quite what to do with version 3. At the sheriff's department, Deputy Carmen Reyes heard the story from her sister, who had heard it from Dave's wife. Carmen had grown up in Red Valley. She had known Rachel Morgan for 6 years, had been to her shop twice for repairs, had stood next to her at 3 community fundraisers, had nodded at her in the grocery store more times than she could count. She had never known Rachel's history. Not really. She knew Rachel had lived somewhere else before Red Valley. She knew Rachel rode with some motorcycle club because occasionally a group of bikes would come through town and stop at the shop, and they were clearly comfortable with each other in the way that people are when they have a long history and don't need to explain themselves. But Carmen had not asked questions. In her experience, people who were living quietly in small towns after a previous life elsewhere were usually doing so because the quiet was the point. You didn't pull on that thread. Now she pulled on the thread. She typed Rachel Morgan's name into the database with the particular feeling of a person who is not sure they want to know what they're about to find. What came back was not a criminal record. What came back was a series of incident reports and witness statements from 3 different counties, spanning about 7 years. Rachel Morgan as a material witness. Rachel Morgan as a person of interest who was subsequently cleared. Rachel Morgan as someone law enforcement had spoken to in connection with 7 different cases, in none of which she had been charged with anything. In all of which, the outcomes had been what the relevant agencies considered positive. And in the associated files, repeated references to a motorcycle organization called the Devil's Compass, which functioned as the top operational crew within the Hells Angels charter network in the Southwest region. And in those files, a name. Rachel Morgan, identified as crew leader. Devil's Compass. Carmen sat back in her chair. She thought about Rachel in her overalls, with the motor oil on her forearms. She thought about Mason Cole, who was 23 years old and had a black belt and a father with money and absolutely no idea what he had just done. Carmen reached for her phone. She called Rachel's number. Rachel picked up on the second ring. Carmen, Rachel said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the name on the screen. I just looked you up, Carmen said. I know. Rachel, this fight isn't a fight. It's just a conversation that's going to happen in public. He has a black belt. I know. He trains every day. He's 23 years old, and he Carmen. Rachel's voice was gentle. Are you calling because you're worried about me or because you're worried about him? Carmen opened her mouth. Closed it. Both, she finally said honestly. Don't be worried about me, Rachel said. And as for him, she paused. Sure, there's an EMT on site on Saturday. Not for me, just in case. She hung up. Carmen sat at her desk for a long time, looking at the file on her screen. Then, she called the county and arranged for a medical unit to be present at the Saturday gathering. Just in case. Gerald Cole heard about the fight from Mason at dinner that same night. Gerald was 58 years old. He had the smooth, practiced look of a man who had spent decades in rooms where the goal was to appear reasonable while doing unreasonable things. He wore good clothes with the casual confidence of someone who had long since stopped thinking about the cost of things. He listened to Mason tell the story with the calm of someone whose first instinct was always to assess how a situation affected his interests before deciding how to feel about it. A mechanic, Gerald said. A woman who runs a motorcycle shop, Mason said. She mouthed off in front of her customers, and I know what you did, Gerald said quietly. I'm asking you to tell me why you thought it was necessary. Mason met his father's eyes across the dinner table. There was something between them, not warmth, exactly, but a kind of mutual recognition. They operated on the same frequency in most things. The shop is in the way, Mason said. You know it's in the way. The access road, the customer traffic, the whole look. She's the reason the community is resistant to the development. She's the one people listen to. If she's publicly embarrassed, that changes things. Gerald considered this. And if she's not embarrassed, he said. She will be, Mason said. She's a mechanic. I know what you are, Gerald said. What I'm asking is whether you looked into her before you opened your mouth. Mason frowned. What's to look into? Gerald looked at his son for a long moment. Then he set down his fork. Have someone do a background check, he said. Before Saturday, Dad. She's a small-town mechanic. She's Mason. Gerald's voice didn't rise either. It had a different quality from Rachel's quiet, where hers was grounded. His was controlled in the way that a pressurized container is controlled. Do the check. The background check came back Friday afternoon. Gerald Cole read it at his desk in the temporary office he was renting downtown. He read it twice. Then he called Mason. Call it off, he said. What? Mason was at the gym. Gerald could hear the weights, the ambient noise, the fight. Saturday. Call it off. Dad? The whole town knows. I can't. You can and you will. What did you find? Gerald looked at the report on his desk. He thought about the 7 cases. He thought about the name Devil's Compass. He thought about the fact that he had been operating in this town for 8 months and had never once seen a single member of the motorcycle community show up at a town council meeting to push back against his development plans. even though he knew they had to be aware of them, because small towns work that way, and now he understood why. They hadn't needed to attend the meetings. They had Rachel. She's not a mechanic who rides motorcycles, Gerald said carefully. She's a motorcycle community leader who repairs bikes as a profession. A silence on Mason's end. I don't. She leads the top operational crew in the Hells Angels Southwest Network, Gerald said. Devil's Compass. She stepped back from active operations roughly 4 years ago. She is, as far as anyone in law enforcement can determine, personally responsible for the resolution of 7 separate significant incidents across 3 counties. Resolution meaning they went away. Quietly. Correctly. Without anyone getting charged with anything that stuck. Another silence. Mason. Gerald's voice was carefully even. She has contacts. She has loyalty from people who operate at levels we don't have access to. And she has been in this town for 4 years, building community trust without once using any of that leverage, which means she has chosen deliberately not to use it, and you just gave her a reason to. The silence on Mason's end was different now. The ambient gym noise continued, but Mason's presence within it had shifted. I can still win the fight, he said, but it was quieter. That's not the point, Gerald said. Win or lose, you've put us in contact with her network. You've made this personal. I've been operating here for 8 months, precisely because I've kept this impersonal. Legal. Distant. And now, he stopped. Call it off, he said again. It's too late, Mason said. The whole town is showing up tomorrow. Gerald closed his eyes. Then control yourself, he said. Don't hurt her. Whatever you do not physically hurt her. I'm a black belt. I'm not going to hurt Mason. And now something in Gerald's voice shifted, something that cut through the practiced control. Something almost close to fear, though Gerald Cole had spent a long time training himself to not feel that. Listen to me. If you hurt her, we don't get to leave this town quietly. We don't get to leave at all. The weights continued clanking in the background. Okay, Mason said. Not confident now. Not performing. Just quiet. Gerald hung up and sat at his desk in the rented office, in the small desert town he had thought was an easy acquisition, and he thought about the fact that for the first time in a long career of impersonal transactions, he might have accidentally made something very personal indeed. The night before the gathering, Danny found Rachel in the shop after midnight. She was not working on a motorcycle. She was sitting on the workbench with a cup of tea, looking at the wall where she kept a small collection of photographs tacked up between the parts calendars and the technical diagrams. Most of the photos were community moments, fundraisers, gatherings, people she'd helped over the years. One was a faded picture of a group of riders on a desert road, taken from behind so you couldn't see their faces. Just the bikes and the road and the horizon. You should be sleeping, she said without turning around. So should you, Danny said. He pulled a stool over and sat. Can I ask you something? You're going to ask me something, regardless. Why didn't you just refuse? Walk away? You've walked away from bigger things. Rachel looked at the faded photograph on the wall. Because he grabbed you, she said. Rachel, you can't. I can also not explain myself, she said. Not even to you. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, are you scared? She turned to look at him. Her expression was something between amusement and affection. Of him, she said. Of what happens after, Danny said. If people start looking at you differently, if they start asking questions. Rachel looked at her tea. I've been in this town 4 years, she said. I've put 4 years of work into what people think of when they think of me. The garage, the community program, old Pete's carburetor, she paused. One afternoon in the middle of a motorcycle gathering is not going to undo 4 years. Unless it goes badly, it won't go badly. You sound very sure. I am very sure. Danny looked at her. Because you know you'll win. Because I know what I'm doing, she said, which is different. Danny was quiet again. The shop hummed with the particular nighttime silence of a space that works hard during the day and rests without relaxing at night, tools on their hooks, parts in their bins, the faint smell of oil and metal that had soaked into the walls over years. They're coming tomorrow, Danny said finally. Aren't they? It wasn't really a question. They were always going to be in the area, Rachel said. Regional gathering weekend, it's coincidence. You texted Vikai, kept him informed. That's different from calling them in. Danny looked at her for a long moment. Is it? Rachel set down her tea. V and I have known each other for 12 years, she said. When I left, I didn't disappear. I stepped back. There's a difference. They know where I am. They've always known where I am. And they've respected my choice to run a garage and live quietly, because that's what people do when they actually respect each other. She paused. I texted him because he'd want to know, not because I need them. I've never needed them for something like this. Something like this, Danny repeated. What is this exactly? Rachel looked at her brother, at the stubborn jaw and the dark eyes and the way he held himself steady, careful, but with the same undercurrent of protectiveness that she had always recognized because she felt it herself. This, she said, is a young man who grabbed my brother and has been poisoning my customers and blocking my road because he thinks the world divides into people who have power and people who don't. And he has never in his life met someone who has power and chooses not to use it, so he doesn't know the category exists. She stood up, stretched, and picked up her teacup. Tomorrow, she said, he's going to find out it exists. She walked to the back door, paused with her hand on the frame. Lock up when you leave, she said. Danny sat alone in the shop for a long time after that, looking at the faded photograph of the riders on the desert road, the bikes and the open horizon and the heat shimmering up from the asphalt. He thought about all the things his sister had never told him, and about all the ways she had, without ever saying a word. Saturday morning arrived the way Saturday mornings do in desert towns in August, without apology, without shadow, with the particular flat white light that presses down on everything and makes the distances look both closer and less real. The Red Valley annual motorcycle gathering had been a tradition for 11 years. It occupied the town center, a long, wide stretch of road that temporarily became something between a fairground and a community festival, with vendors and music and the particular energy of a large group of people who had chosen to be there for reasons that were mostly joyful. This year, the gathering had an undercurrent. Everyone who was coming knew about the challenge. Everyone who had heard the story had an opinion. The people who showed up early staked out positions not deliberately, not strategically, but in the way that crowds arrange themselves around anticipated drama. A collective intuition about sightlines and proximity. Mason arrived at 10:30 with his crew and his championship belt. Not wearing it, that would have been too obvious. But it was in the truck. A reminder. A talisman. He looked good. He was 6 feet even, well built, with the kind of conditioned physicality that comes from consistent training over years. He moved with the confidence of someone who had won competitions in front of crowds before and knew how to carry himself in public view. His father was not there. Gerald sent a message that morning. Handle it. No injuries. Call me when it's over. Mason's friends positioned themselves in a loose group. They were dressed casually, not dressed for a fight, dressed for a day out, which somehow made it more intimidating. They belonged here. They were relaxed. Rachel arrived at 11. She came on her bike, a 1984 Harley rebuilt herself from components over the course of 3 years. It was not flashy. It was not chrome-covered and gleaming. It was working black paint and functional components, and the sound of an engine that had been tuned by someone who understood it completely. She wore jeans and a dark leather jacket and boots. No armor, no preparation gear. She parked her bike and swung off it and walked through the crowd the way she always walked through the crowd, nodding at people she knew, stopping to squeeze an old woman's hand, saying something brief and apparently funny to 2 men in their 60s who laughed in the way people laugh when someone they genuinely like says something. She did not look at Mason, not ignoring him, not performing indifference, simply not looking, because she had things to do first, and he would still be there when she was done with them. That somehow was more unnerving than anything she could have said. Mason watched her cross the crowd. He had expected some reaction to his presence, some acknowledgement of what this day was about, some visible evidence that she had spent the night worrying or preparing, or at least aware of the magnitude of what she had agreed to. She greeted an old veteran like they were best friends. She knelt down to talk to a child who ran up to her with some kind of urgent news. She accepted a cup of something from a woman at a food vendor while having a conversation that seemed to be about a motorcycle part. Mason put his hands in his pockets and waited. At 12:15, the crowd shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the particular movement of a large group of people responding to something at the edge of their awareness before they had consciously processed what it was. The sound came first, then the bikes. They came from the eastern road, not fast, not threatening, not in a formation that was designed to be imposing. They came the way a group of people come when they're going somewhere. They have every right to be, and they'd like you to move out of the way politely if you don't mind. 17 motorcycles. The riders wore their cuts, the Hells Angels leather vests, with the patches and the insignia and the quiet, direct visual language of an organization that had existed for decades and had never needed to explain itself to anyone. They parked along the edge of the gathering space, engines going quiet one by one in a rolling sequence that sounded almost musical. The crowd watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke at full volume. The ambient noise of the gathering dropped by about half in about 30 seconds, the way it does when something has entered a room that the room doesn't quite know how to categorize. The riders got off their bikes. Some of them got food. Some of them talked to each other. None of them did anything threatening. But they were there, and they were watching. Mason looked at his crew. His crew looked at Mason. One of them leaned in. "Did you know they were going to be here?" he said quietly. "Regional gathering weekend," Mason said. His voice was steady. "They were always going to be in the area." His crew said nothing else. Mason looked across the crowd to where Rachel was still standing, with the woman from the food vendor still holding her cup. And now finally, she was looking at him. Not with challenge, not with anger, with something far more difficult to respond to. With patience. The kind that belongs to someone who has already done the math. The crowd pressed in. The music stopped. Someone's radio found a new station and then went quiet. Mason Cole and Rachel Morgan looked at each other. Across the town center of Red Valley, Arizona, the desert light pressed down on everything. And the story that had been building since a Tuesday morning in a gravel lot, since a hand on a shoulder and a quiet voice saying, "Don't touch me," since an old man's carburetor and a younger brother's collar and a generation's worth of careful, deliberate chosen quiet, the story arrived. The crowd held its breath. Mason Cole had trained for moments like this his entire life. The pressure of a public stage, the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides, the specific chemistry of adrenaline and ego that either sharpens a fighter or exposes him. He had stood in front of judges, referees, cameras, and screaming audiences. He knew how to use a crowd. He knew how to feed off attention and return it amplified, how to make the people watching feel like they were part of something significant. But he had never stood in front of a crowd that wasn't sure who to root for. That was different. That specific uncertainty, he could feel it moving through the people around him like a current, and it was not the current he was used to. Usually the crowd arrived already shaped. They'd seen his credentials, his trophies, his videos. They came predisposed. He just had to perform. This crowd had known Rachel Morgan for 4 years. He walked toward the center of the open space, and the crowd gave him room. That part was familiar. But the room they gave him felt more like caution than deference. The kind of spacey people create not because they're impressed, but because they're uncertain what's about to happen and they want distance from the consequences. Rachel handed her cup back to the vendor woman, said something brief, and walked forward. The 17 riders from the Eastern Road didn't move. They didn't need to. They were already exactly where they needed to be present, visible, watching. One of them, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with close-cropped gray hair, stood slightly separate from the others with his arms crossed and his eyes on Rachel. Not protective exactly, more like attentive. The way a person watches someone they trust completely, waiting to see if they're needed and ready to accept if they're not. Rachel stopped about 10 feet from Mason. "You asked for this," Mason said. It came out less steady than he intended. He'd meant it as an opening statement, something that established the frame of the encounter, put him in the position of responding to her provocation rather than generating his own. Instead, it sounded, just slightly, like a man reminding himself of something. "You challenged me," Rachel said. "There's a difference. Either way." He rolled his shoulders, the practiced pre-fight loosening that was half physiological and half performance. Here we are, Rachel said. From behind Mason, one of his crew, the big one with the neck tattoo, whose name was Trent, called out, "Come on, Mason. Let's see it." The energy in the crowd shifted at that, not toward Mason. Away from Trent, a faint but collective recoil at the tone of it. The casual cruelty of someone who thought this was entertainment. A man near the front of the crowd, old enough to have grandchildren at his knees, said quietly but audibly, "Boy doesn't know what he's standing in front of." His wife shushed him, but not because she disagreed. Mason heard it. His jaw tightened. He moved. He came in fast and clean, which was to his credit. Whatever else he was not a brawler. His first combination was technical, a probing jab to establish distance, a cross that followed it by half a second, designed to find out whether she'd move left or right so he could set up the angle for his real attack. It was smart fighting. It was what someone with genuine training did when they didn't know their opponent's habits yet. Rachel moved left, not because left was safer, because she had read the combination in the first half second of his movement, understood where the real attack was coming from, and stepping left moved her inside the arc of it rather than away from it, which meant his power was already spent by the time anything reached her. His cross connected with nothing. His momentum carried him past her by 2 steps. He recovered faster than most people would have good athleticism, good instincts, and he'd been hit enough in training to know how to manage a miss. He pivoted and came back. The crowd hadn't made a sound. That silence was its own kind of atmosphere. Not the held breath silence of people watching something dangerous. The particular quiet of people watching something they don't quite have the vocabulary for yet. Mason came in again. This time different, less combination, more pressure. He was trying to put her somewhere, to use his size and forward drive to push her back and establish control of the space. It worked in competition. It worked in sparring. It worked on everyone he'd tested it on. Rachel didn't go backward. She went sideways, fractionally, and something happened with her right hand, not a strike. Exactly. More a redirection. A small, precise movement that altered the geometry of his push so that instead of driving her back, it drove him slightly off center. He planted his foot to correct, and she was already elsewhere. "She's not fighting him," someone in the crowd said. A woman's voice, somewhere in her 50s, the tone of someone who knows what she's watching. "She's correcting him." This was the moment. The first real shift happened in the gathered crowd, because the woman was right, and once she said it, people could see it. Rachel was not trying to defeat Mason Cole. She was responding to him, adjusting to him, declining every invitation he offered her toward escalation, and doing it with a kind of easiness that was more devastating than aggression would have been. Every move she didn't make was its own statement. Every opportunity she passed up was its own education. Mason understood this on some level. He was trained enough to feel the shape of what was happening, even if his pride refused to name it. He increased his speed, brought more power into his next sequence, committed harder. Rachel took 2 steps back for the first time, giving him the space, and then used the space he was rushing to fill her timing precise. Her movement deliberate, and he felt something close at the back of his leg, and he was on the ground. Not hard, not painful. He was down before he felt the impact, which was the worst part, because he hadn't felt her do it. He had simply been standing, and then he was not standing, and the ground was solid against his palms and his knee. The crowd exhaled. Mason was back on his feet in under 2 seconds. Good reflexes. Real training. But the color in his face was different now, not the red of exertion. The darker color of humiliation spreading up from his collar. "You've been trained," he said. He was breathing harder than he should have been for this amount of time. "Who taught you?" "Lots of people," Rachel said. "Who?" "People who understood that what you do with training matters more than how much of it you have." He came at her again. The next several minutes were the ones that old Pete Delgado would describe for years in the plastic chair at Rachel's garage, with the particular authority of someone who had seen enough of the world to know when something important was happening. Pete would say, the boy was good. Don't let anyone tell you he wasn't. He had real ability. It just wasn't the right kind for what he was trying to do. What Pete meant, though he didn't always say it this way, was that Mason Cole had been trained to win, to defeat an opponent who was trying to defeat him back. His entire skill set was built on a foundation of mutual aggression. You bring force. I absorb or redirect it and return it harder. Every technique he knew operated on the assumption that the other person was trying to do the same thing he was doing. Rachel was not trying to do what he was doing. She was trying to demonstrate something. And demonstration is a different discipline than competition. 3 times he took her to the edge of something, a combination that came close enough that she had to fully commit to her defense. A moment where his speed and her decision-making were nearly simultaneous. A sequence that the crowd reacted to with the involuntary sound that happens when danger is genuinely close. 3 times she came through the other side of it with her feet under her and her breathing controlled. Each time, she looked at him afterward with that same expression. Patient, steady, waiting for him to understand something. He did not understand it yet. He was too angry. His anger was not the hot, explosive kind that makes people sloppy. It was the cold, grinding kind that comes from intelligence, encountering an obstacle it can't categorize. He kept trying to reframe what was happening. She's defensive. She's running. She's afraid to commit. She's relying on technique, and sooner or later technique runs out when power gets close enough. He kept telling himself these things and kept moving and kept finding that none of them were true. The cold anger got colder. His crew had gone quiet. Trent, who had called out from behind him with that lazy, confident tone, was no longer saying anything. The 4 of them stood in their casual clothes and watched with expressions that had shifted from entertainment to something more complicated. One of them, a young man named Kyle, who had been Mason's training partner for 2 years, said quietly, to no one in particular, "She's waiting for him to stop." Trent looked at him. "What?" "She's waiting," Kyle said again. "Every time she could push the advantage, she doesn't. She's waiting for him to." He stopped. He didn't quite have the language for it either. "She's not trying to beat him. She's trying to outlast his ego." Trent had no response to that. Kyle watched Rachel avoid another combination with that same precise, minimal movement, and he felt something uncomfortable move through him, the recognition of skill so far, beyond what he'd assumed was in the room, that it reordered his understanding of the last 20 minutes, of the last 23 years of Mason's public life. Honestly, of what it meant that the people you walked through the world intimidating were not, in fact, people you understood. At the edge of the gathered space, the broad-shouldered man with the close-cropped gray hair had not moved from his position. His name was Victor Reyes, no relation to Carmen, and he had known Rachel Morgan for 14 years. He had ridden with her across 4 states. He had sat in a hospital waiting room with her once, for reasons neither of them talked about anymore. He had watched her make decisions that most people in their world would never have had the restraint to make, and he had understood each time why she made them, even when he might have chosen differently. He watched her move through Mason Cole's attacks with the unhurried precision that he recognized from 14 years of knowing her, and he felt the particular combination of pride and protectiveness that had no clean name, not fatherly, not romantic, not the word loyalty exactly, though that was closest. The feeling that comes from watching someone you have built real trust with over real time do exactly what you knew they were capable of. A man nearby leaned over to him and said, not unkindly, with genuine curiosity. You know her well? Victor looked at the man. Older, local, the kind of face that had spent decades in desert sunlight. Long time, Victor said. She always been like this? Victor thought about it. No, he said. She learned it. The old man nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected. What did she learn? Victor watched Rachel sidestep something that would have been painful if it had connected, and he said that the most dangerous thing you can be is calm when someone else isn't. Mason went down the second time at the 16-minute mark. This time, it was not a clean takedown. This time he had committed everything to a single driving forward strike, and Rachel had simply not been in front of it, and the force of his own momentum had done most of the work. He went down harder than the first time and got up slower. The crowd made a sound, not a cheer, not for her and not against him. The sound a crowd makes when they have been watching something they didn't fully understand, and they have just understood it. Mason stood with his hands on his knees for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then he was upright, because whatever he was not someone who stayed down. He would get credit for that later from people who were being honest. His face was a composition of things that didn't go together, humiliation and fury, and something underneath both of those that was less familiar to him, something that might have been, if he'd had the language for it, the first small crack in a wall that had never been tested before. You could have done that the first time, he said. His voice was rougher than he wanted it to be. I know, Rachel said. Then why didn't you? She looked at him. Because winning wasn't the point. That landed in him strangely. He felt it go in, but he didn't know what to do with it yet. He was still in the machinery of the fight, still in the physiological state of combat, and his brain was trying to find the place to file what she just said and couldn't locate it. Then what's the point? He said. You'll figure it out, she said. Give it some time. He stared at her. For the first time in this entire encounter, he had absolutely nothing to say. The crowd found its voice in pieces, the way a crowd does after something that isn't a competition. Individual voices first, then conversations, then the ambient buzz of shared experience being processed communally. Deputy Carmen Reyes, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd since 11 o'clock, let out a breath she had been holding for longer than she realized. She put her radio back on her belt and looked at the EMT unit parked 20 yards away, still idle. Their crew watching with the particular professional restraint of people who were glad they hadn't been needed. She looked at Rachel, who had moved back to where she'd started standing near the food vendor, as if the last 20 minutes were a weather event that had passed through, and the sensible thing was to return to where you'd been. She looked at Mason Cole, who was standing in the center of the open space with his crew gathering around him. And she watched the crew's body language and saw that it had changed. They were not rallying around him the way they had when they'd arrived. They were standing near him, the way people stand near someone when they're not quite sure what the right thing to do is. Trent had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the ground. Kyle, the training partner, was looking at Rachel. Carmen walked through the crowd toward Rachel, and when she reached her, Rachel was already looking at her. You good? Carmen said. Fine, you want me to. Carmen gestured vaguely toward Mason. No, Rachel said. Leave him alone. He needs to stand there for a minute. Carmen looked across the crowd to where Mason stood, then back to Rachel. You knew what you were doing the whole time, Carmen said. Yes, you could have ended it in the first 30 seconds. Rachel picked up the cup she'd set down and found it still had something in it. She drank from it. Probably, she said. Then why? Because ending it in 30 seconds doesn't teach anything, Rachel said. And he needed to learn something. She paused. He still needs to learn something. We haven't gotten to the learning part yet. This was just the opening. Carmen processed this. What's the learning part? She said. Rachel set down her cup. That's not up to me, she said. I can put someone in a position where they have to look at themselves. What they do with the view that's theirs. The mood of the gathering shifted in the hour after the fight with the particular organic quality of a community reassembling its understanding of something. The conversations were everywhere at the food vendors, near the bikes, in the parking areas, at the edges of the event where people who needed to process quietly drifted and found each other. The fight had been a flashpoint, but the conversations that followed it were about more than the fight, because people had not just seen a woman defeat a young fighter with superior skill. They had seen something that was harder to articulate and therefore more important. They had seen someone with power choose what to do with it in public, in front of them, in real time. An older woman named Dolores, who ran the flower shop on Main and had been attending the gathering for 9 years, sat with 3 friends and said, "I've seen men fight here before. I've seen competitions. This was not competition. I don't know what it was exactly, but it was not competition." Her friend Margaret, retired school teacher, said, "It was a lesson." For him, Dolores said. For everyone, Margaret said. They sat with that for a moment. She went easy on him, said the third woman. Patricia, who had grown up in a military family and knew enough about physical training to recognize restraint when she saw it. Not a little easy, substantially easy. She paused. She could have made it very short and very embarrassing. She didn't. Why do you think she didn't? Dolores asked. Patricia thought about it. Because she's going to have to live next to these people, Patricia said slowly. Or rather, they're going to have to live next to her. And there's a difference between defeating someone and leaving them with something they can use. The 4 of them sat with that too. Mason Cole stood near his truck and did not speak for a long time. His crew had eventually given him space, not abandoning him, but giving him the particular courtesy that people extend when they understand that someone needs to be alone with something. Kyle stayed closest. Kyle, who had known him for 2 years, who had trained with him 4 mornings a week, who had watched him compete and win and post the videos and grow into the public identity he'd built. Kyle sat on the truck's running board and waited. Eventually, Mason said she wasn't scared. No, Kyle said. She was never scared. Not for a second, no. Mason looked at his hands. His knuckles had not connected with much. That was part of what was sitting badly. He had been in this for 20+ minutes and he had landed almost nothing. Everything he'd brought, all the training and the conditioning and the genuine ability he'd developed over years, and almost none of it had found its target. I thought she was hiding behind the community thing, Mason said. The garage, the old people. He stopped. I thought it was a front, something to manage perception. You were wrong, Kyle said. I was completely wrong. He paused. It's not a front. It's who she is. She's not using the community to build a reputation. The reputation is real because what she does is real. He turned this over. She helped that old man's motorcycle because she wanted to, not for optics. She's been doing it for 4 years because that's what she chose when she stepped back from. He stopped again. Kyle looked at him. From whatever she stepped back from, Mason finished. Kyle said, "Your dad called me." Mason looked at him sharply. When this morning, before the fight, Kyle held his gaze. He told me what he found in the background check. He asked me to. He wanted someone close to you to know, in case things went sideways. What did he find? You know what he found. You can see what she is. I know who she leads, Mason said. His voice was flat. I know what the devil's compass is. My dad told me to call it off. Why didn't you? The question sat there. Mason had an answer. He'd had an answer when his father called the crowd already knows. It's too late, I can't back down in public. Those were reasons. They were real reasons. But they were not the real reason, and Kyle had known him long enough to recognize the difference. Because I thought I could still win, Mason said finally. Even knowing what she was, even knowing the organization behind her. I thought my training, he stopped. The sentence didn't need to be finished. Both of them could feel where it ended and what it revealed. Kyle said nothing. That was the right call. Mason looked at his hands again. Strength is not proven by how many people you can scare, he said. It came out quietly. Not performing it, not quoting it. Just saying it. The way you say something when you're finally hearing it for the first time, even though you heard it before. She said that to you, Kyle asked. Before the fight. First day. Mason looked up and across the gathering space to where Rachel was standing with the gray-haired rider, talking normal, as if the afternoon had been unremarkable. I laughed. Kyle followed his gaze. What do you think she meant? Kyle said. Mason thought about it for a long time. I think she meant that I've been scaring people my whole life and calling it respect, he said, and that she's been doing the opposite and getting the real thing. Kyle nodded. What are you going to do? He said. Mason looked across the gathering space at Rachel Morgan, who was laughing at something the gray-haired man had said. Fully present, unhurried, completely herself, in the middle of a crowd of people who loved her, without needing to announce it. I don't know yet, Mason said honestly, and for the first time in a very long time, not knowing something did not feel like a threat. Victor Reyes found Rachel near the edge of the gathering at 3 in the afternoon, and they walked together the way they had walked 100 times in 100 places, side by side, not quite talking, letting the space between them carry the weight of what they knew about each other. You didn't need us, Victor said. It was not a question. I didn't need you, Rachel agreed. But you wanted us to know. I always want you to know, she said. That's different. They walked a few more steps. The Cole boy's father is going to be a problem, Victor said. The development, the land. That doesn't go away because his son got humbled. No, Rachel said. It doesn't. You have a plan for the father? I have the beginning of one. She glanced at him. The legal kind. Victor made a sound that was approximately satisfaction. You have good contacts, he said. For the legal kind. I have you, she said. You know people who know people. I always know people who know people. Then yes, she said. I have a plan. Victor nodded. They walked a few more paces. The boy, Victor's son. What do you think? Rachel considered it honestly. I think he's not what he's been performing to be, she said. I think there's something worth reaching underneath the performance. I think today was the first time in his life that the performance didn't work, and I think that's terrifying and necessary. You going to reach? Victor said. Not yet, Rachel said. Today he learns what he's not. That's enough for one day. Victor looked at her sideways. And tomorrow? Rachel looked out at the gathering, the people and the bikes, and the ordinary human texture of a community that had known her long enough to be hers, in the truest sense of the word, without needing to own her. Tomorrow, she said, we start the harder conversation. Victor nodded again. He reached out and touched her shoulder briefly, not a hug, not a formal gesture, just contact, the kind that says, I was here, I saw, I know. Rachel put her hand over his for just a second. Then they both went back to the gathering. The desert afternoon continued its indifferent burn. The motorcycles glinted in their rows along the edge of the road. And somewhere on the other side of the crowd, Mason Cole sat on the running board of his truck and started, for the first time in his life, to genuinely think. Mason Cole did not sleep that night. He lay on the hotel bed in the room his father was paying for, because Gerald Cole had rented the suite at the only decent hotel in Red Valley for the duration of the development project, and Mason had been staying there since he arrived. In the way that sons with wealthy fathers stay in places they didn't earn and don't think about, and he stared at the ceiling and replayed the afternoon in the particular, unsparing way that the mind replays things when it has no defense left to offer. He replayed the moment her hand had redirected his momentum, and he'd found himself on the ground before he understood how he'd gotten there. He replayed the second time, the worst time, when he'd committed everything and found nothing, and the ground had come up to meet him like a fact. He replayed her face throughout. That was the thing that wouldn't leave him. Not her technique, not her footwork, not the clinical precision with which she'd handled everything he'd thrown her face. The consistency of her expression, patient, settled, looking at him the way an experienced teacher looks at a student making an error they've seen 1,000 times, waiting for the moment comprehension arrives. She had never been angry, not once. He had been furious from the first minute, and she had been calm from the first second, and the difference between those two states had been the entire story of the afternoon. His phone had 47 notifications. He didn't look at any of them. He knew what they were, his Fighting Academy contacts. The people who followed his videos, The coaches who'd invested time in him over the years. All of them wanting an explanation for what the footage showed, because of course there was footage. There was always footage now. Someone in the crowd had been recording from the first 60 seconds, and by the time the afternoon was over, the video was in circulation. He hadn't watched it either. He was afraid of what he'd see in his own face. At 2 in the morning, his phone rang. Not a notification, a call. His father's name on the screen. He picked up. "I watched the video," Gerald said. "I know. You didn't call it off." A pause. Not a comfortable one. "Are you hurt?" Gerald said. And there was something in that question, underneath the assessment, underneath the strategic mind processing, implications, something that was just a father asking if his son was hurt. Mason registered it without knowing what to do with it, which was a problem he had had for a long time with his father. "No," Mason said. She was careful," Gerald repeated. The words had a weight to them. "She could have hurt me," Mason said. "She chose not to." Another pause. "The video is spreading," Gerald said. "Not the way I expected." "What do you mean?" "I expected it to spread as a fight video. A novelty. The black belt loses to the mechanic. People share it for the spectacle." Gerald's voice was measured. "Careful. That's not how it's spreading." Mason sat up on the edge of the bed. "How is it spreading?" he said. "People are sharing it as something else," Gerald said. "They're not sharing the falls. They're sharing what she does in between. The moment she could hurt you and doesn't. People are." He paused. And Mason heard something unusual in his father's voice. Something that took him a moment to identify. Discomfort. Gerald Cole was not a man who experienced discomfort easily. "People are calling her remarkable." Mason sat with that. "She is remarkable," he said. The silence that followed was different from the silences earlier in the call. His father was processing something. "Mace," Gerald said, "I need you to understand the position this puts our development project in." And just like that, the moment was over, and his father was back to business. And Mason felt the familiar mixture of relief and disappointment that had characterized his relationship with Gerald since he was old enough to notice that warmth in his father had a consistent shelf life. "The community trust around that woman is not what I calculated," Gerald continued. "I assessed her as a local presence. Friendly goodwill. Manageable. I did not calculate for," he stopped, "for whatever she actually is. She's exactly what she appears to be," Mason said. "That's the thing you didn't calculate for. She's exactly who people think she is. That's not common." Gerald was quiet. "Pull back the road blockage," Mason said. "Tomorrow. First thing. Pull it back, Dad." His voice was steadier than he felt. "Whatever legal play you're running on the access road, drop it. It's not worth what it costs. The development is in a town where every single person saw what happened today," Mason said, "and where every single person knows that the way we've been operating is the reason it happened. Pull back the road." He paused. "It's the minimum." The silence stretched. "All right," Gerald said finally. Not warmly. Not with any acknowledgement of what it had taken for his son to say that. Just the pragmatic concession of a man recalculating odds. Mason hung up and sat on the edge of the hotel bed and felt the weight of 23 years of choices pressing down on him in a way that was specific and uncomfortable. And underneath the discomfort, unmistakably real. That realness was new. He stayed with it. Rachel heard about the video from Danny at 7 the next morning. She was already in the shop. She was already in the shop. She slept well because she had a clean conscience and woke early because she had work to do. And Danny came in with his phone out, and the look on his face of someone who has information they're not sure is good or bad. "The video's everywhere," he said. "I know." She didn't look up from the parts she was organizing. "Not in a bad way," Danny said. "People are Rachel. People are saying things about you that I can't." He stopped. "A woman in Phoenix shared it. Wrote a paragraph about what you were doing. Why you weren't finishing it. 30,000 shares in 6 hours. Rachel set down the parts. "Show me," she said. She looked at the phone. Read the paragraph the woman in Phoenix had written. Watched about 45 seconds of the video, her own movement, which she observed with the detached critical eye of someone assessing technique rather than performance, and handed the phone back. Okay, she said. Okay. Danny stared at her. This is one video, she said. It'll pass. It's not passing. It's growing. There are comments from there are women all over the country sharing this and saying things about, he gestured, helpless, about dignity, about what real strength looks like, about Danny. She looked at him directly. What do you want me to do with that information? He opened and closed his mouth. I want you to feel good about it, he said finally. I want you to let yourself feel good about something. For 5 minutes. Rachel looked at her brother. For a moment, really looked at him. The way you look at someone when you're deciding how much truth they can handle. I do feel good about it, she said. I feel good every time I do something right. I don't need 30,000 people to share it for that. She picked up her parts again. Pete's bike needs a test ride today. Can you ride it around the block a few times and listen for the hesitation in third gear? Danny stood there for another moment. Then he took the keys from the hook where she'd left them and went out. The access road was clear by 9. No trucks, no crew, no casual obstruction, just open road the way it was supposed to be, the way it had been before Gerald Cole arrived with his money and his plans and his son. Rachel noticed it the moment the first customer mentioned it, Dave Ritter again, because Dave Ritter was a man who showed up regularly and paid attention, who came in that morning with his Indian scout for the service that had been interrupted, and said, before he even greeted her properly, road's clear. I noticed, Rachel said. You make that happen. Indirectly. Dave looked at her for a moment. He was 61 with a bad hip and eyes that had spent decades making accurate assessments of things. Indirectly, he repeated. All right. He handed her his keys. What's it going to take to make it stay that way? Rachel took the keys. That's a longer conversation, she said. Come back at 3. I'll have your bike done and I'll give you the short version. Dave nodded and left. The short version, which she gave him at 3 o'clock while he sat in the plastic chair where Pete usually sat and she worked on final adjustments, was this. Gerald Cole's development plan was not illegal. It was aggressive, and it was designed to benefit Cole interests at the expense of the existing community, but the individual components were within legal parameters. The access road blockage had been borderline, and he had pulled it, which had suggested he was capable of recalculating when the cost became clear. The remaining plan required a community response at the Planning Commission level, documented, organized, and sustained over enough months to matter. Can you organize it? Dave said. I can help organize it, Rachel said. I'm one person. One voice at a planning commission is a complaint. 40 voices is a record. 80 voices is a story. A story changes what's politically viable. Dave was quiet for a moment. You'd know about stories, he said, with a look that suggested he'd seen the video. Rachel handed him his keys. I'd know about communities, she said. That's different. What nobody in Red Valley had quite reckoned with, not Deputy Carmen Reyes, not Victor Reyes, not Gerald Cole with his background checks, not even Danny, who knew her better than almost anyone, was the specific quality of network that Rachel Morgan carried, not through her motorcycle connections, but through 4 years of accumulated quiet goodwill in a town where the population was small enough that 4 years of showing up meant something measurable. It started with Dave Ritter, who went home that evening and called 2 men he'd known since high school. It extended to the woman from the food vendor at the gathering, whose name was Sandra, and who ran the vendor with her husband and had been present for the access road conversation and went to 3 different neighbors that evening. It reached Pete Delgado, who called his grandson, who was 26 and ran a local online community board, and who posted a simple factual summary of what had been happening with the coal development and the road and the Planning Commission timeline. By Wednesday morning, Rachel had 11 people calling her about the Planning Commission. By Thursday, she had 22. She handled each call with the same quality she brought to everything: direct, honest, specific. She did not oversell, did not make promises about outcomes, did not position herself as the leader of a cause. She said, here is what is happening. Here is what the process allows for. Here is when and where that process occurs. Here is what your presence would mean. She was good at this. She had been good at this in a different context for years before Red Valley. And the skills transferred cleanly because they were not context-specific skills. They were human skills. The ability to make people feel that they mattered in something larger than themselves without making them feel used. The ability to hold a room or a phone call or a plastic chair conversation in a garage and leave people more capable than they'd arrived. This was what Gerald Cole had not calculated. He had calculated her motorcycle network. He had not calculated 11 years of carburetor service. On Thursday afternoon, Gerald Cole walked into Rachel's garage. Alone. No lawyers, no son, no crew. Just Gerald Cole in a well-cut shirt with the particular bearing of a man who had decided that a situation required personal management. Rachel was at the workbench when he came in. She looked up, registered him, and returned to what she was doing. She did not ask him to wait. She did not accelerate her work to acknowledge his arrival. She finished the fitting she was in the middle of, set it down, wiped her hands, and looked at him. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Morgan." He looked around the shop with the evaluative gaze of a man who prices everything automatically. "You've built a good operation here." "Thank you." "I mean it." He moved slightly forward, hands loose at his sides. "I've made it my business to understand what I'm dealing with, and I understand that this shop is genuinely central to this community. I want you to know I respect that." Rachel looked at him. "What do you want, Mr. Cole?" she said. He almost smiled. Not warmly, more with the recognition. One capable person shows another capable person when the pleasantries are dispensed with. "I want to talk about a path forward that works for both parties," he said. "Both parties being you and me. You and me. And by extension, the community and the development. The development that your access road strategy was softening this community up for," Rachel said. Not accusatory, just naming it. "The strategy has been abandoned," Gerald said. "As you know." "As I know," Rachel agreed. "And yet the development itself continues." "The development is legal." "The development is legal," Rachel agreed again. "Legal doesn't mean good for the people here." Gerald moved to the plastic chair, Pete's chair, Dave's chair, and sat down with the ease of a man who sits in chairs in other people's spaces as part of his professional routine. "Here's what I know," he said. "I came to Red Valley because the land was undervalued and the zoning was favorable, and I believed the community resistance would be manageable. I made 3 significant errors in that assessment." He held up 3 fingers. 1. I underestimated the cohesion of this community. 2. I underestimated you specifically. 3. I allowed my son to make the situation personal. Rachel leaned against the workbench and crossed her arms, not defensively, just comfortably. "And now," she said, "and now I'm sitting in a garage talking to a woman who has, in the last 72 hours, organized what appears to be a significant portion of this town into a coherent planning commission presence." He lowered his hand. "Which is her absolute right, and which, if it continues the way it's building, will make my project significantly more difficult and expensive and slow." "That's accurate," Rachel said. "So I'm here," Gerald said, "to find out if there's a version of this that works." Rachel looked at him. She took her time with it. "There might be," she said. "But it doesn't look like what you came here planning to build." "Tell me what it looks like," she told him. She was specific, and she was cut, and she was completely without sentiment about it. She talked about the existing businesses on the eastern edge of town and what kinds of development would harm their customer access and what kinds wouldn't. She talked about the community programs that use the open land currently in Cole's acquisition, the youth program, the weekend mechanics training she'd been running for 2 years, the informal gathering space that the motorcycle community used 4 times a year. She talked about what could be built on the adjacent parcels that would add something rather than displace something. Gerald Cole listened. He was a good listener when he decided it was useful, sharp, and specific, asking clarifying questions that told you he was genuinely processing rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He took no notes. He was the kind of man who committed things to memory and didn't want a paper trail until he chose to create one. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, That's a significantly smaller development, he said. It's a different development, Rachel said. Smaller in some ways, more viable in others. A development the community doesn't actively resist has a different long-term value from one they do. You've thought about this from a business perspective, Gerald said. Faint surprise in it, though he was controlling the surprise. I've thought about it from a community perspective, Rachel said. The business logic follows. He looked at her for a long moment. I want to propose something, he said. Go ahead. Mediated negotiation. Formal. Me, a neutral third party. Representatives from the Planning Commission. We take your outline and my project parameters, and we find a version that has a reasonable chance of getting through the commission without a protracted fight. He paused. Because a protracted fight costs me time and money and political capital. And I'd rather spend that building something. Rachel thought about it. Who's the neutral third party? She said. Whoever you want, he said. I'll accept your choice. That surprised her. She didn't show it, but she felt it, the genuine concession in that sentence, the acknowledgement of what her position actually was. Gerald Cole was a man who controlled environments. Offering her the choice of mediator was a significant surrender of environmental control. I'll get back to you, she said. Take the time you need. He stood, straightened his shirt, moved toward the door, and then stopped. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she waited to see what came out of that pause. Miss Morgan, he said, what about it? He turned slightly, not fully facing her. A partial turn, the body language of a man saying something he hadn't planned to say. My son is 23 years old, he said. He has been told he was exceptional since he was 8. I told him that. I invested in it. I believed it was preparation. He stopped. I'm not sure it was preparation. I'm not sure what it was. Rachel said nothing. He's staying in Red Valley, Gerald said. He told me this morning. He's staying through the end of the month. He wants to. Gerald's voice had something rough in it, uncharacteristic. He said he wants to understand what he got wrong. That's a good start, Rachel said. I thought you'd say something more encouraging than that, Gerald said. Starting is hard, Rachel said. I don't dress it up. Gerald Cole turned fully, looked at her one more time, and something in his face was different from when he'd walked in, less armored, though not unguarded, more like a man who had temporarily stopped performing the version of himself he usually performed. No, he said. I imagine you don't. He left. Rachel stood in the shop alone and let silence settle back around her the way it did after significant things, not emptiness, but the particular texture of air after something real has happened in it. Mason came on Friday. He did not call first. He did not text. He drove to the garage at 10 in the morning and parked in the correct parking area and walked to the open bay and stopped at the threshold and said, "Can I talk to you?" Rachel was under a truck. She slid out on the creeper, sat up, and looked at him. He looked worse than he had at the gathering. Not physically, he was fine. But there was something stripped from his face that had been there before. The performance layer. The default expression of someone who has spent years being looked at and has developed a relationship with being looked at that is more armor than openness. Without it, he looked younger and considerably more real. You can talk, she said. He didn't know how to start. She could see that the specific discomfort of someone who has always had language for the person they perform being and is suddenly trying to speak as the person underneath. I watched the video, he said finally. I watched myself. He stopped. I've watched myself fight 100 times. For technique. For improvement. I've always been able to watch and identify what I did well and what I did wrong and correct. He stopped again. I watched this video, and the only thing I could identify that I did wrong was everything that happened before the fight. The road. Danny. The challenge. He looked at her. The fight itself was the least of it. Rachel put her hands on her knees. What do you want from me, she said. Not unkindly. Directly. I don't know, he said. And that honesty was its own kind of arrival. I wanted to say I was wrong. I wanted to say it to you specifically. Not on the internet, not in a statement, not to my crew. To you. Because you're the person I wronged he paused. And the only person whose opinion I seem to care about right now, which doesn't make sense to me, but there it is. Rachel stood up from the creeper. Saying you were wrong is a starting point, she said. It's not the work. I know. The work is longer and harder, and most people stop before they get to it. I know that too. She looked at him. He held the look, did not flinch from it, did not redirect it, which was itself something. There's a program, she said. Community youth program. We run it out of the old meeting hall on Clement Street. Discipline, but responsibility, basic mechanics, life skills for kids who don't have a lot of structure at home. We need adults who can teach discipline from experience. She paused. Not adults who talk about being champions. Adults who can talk about being wrong and what comes after. Mason was quiet. That's what you're offering me, he said. That's what I'm telling you exists, she said. What you do with the information is up to you. He looked at his hands, then at her. When does it meet, he said. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she said. 6 o'clock. Bring work clothes. The kids are hard on equipment. Something moved through his face. Not relief, more fundamental than relief. The look of a person who has been handed a next step after believing there wasn't one. Okay, he said. She nodded and picked up her tools and went back to work. He stood in the doorway for another moment and then he left. And what happened in the week that followed was the kind of thing that small towns are built to hold the incremental, unglamorous, deeply human work of people adjusting to a new truth. The Planning Commission meeting was on the following Tuesday evening, and the room held 63 people where it normally held 12. Gerald Cole's attorney was present. The development firm's representative was present. 4 county officials who had driven down specifically because the attendance number had flagged the meeting as significant were present. And 63 members of the Red Valley community were present, organized and specific and prepared with documented concerns about the development timeline, the access implications, the displacement of existing community use of the land, and the economic impact on the Eastern businesses, all of it structured around the outline. Rachel had given Gerald Cole in her garage because she had shared that outline with the community organizers, and they had used it as the framework for their presentation. Rachel sat in the 3rd row and did not speak until it was her turn, and when it was her turn, she spoke 4 minutes and she was precise, and she was documented, and she was utterly without performance. And when she sat down, the room was different in the way that rooms are different when something accurate has been said aloud. Gerald Cole's attorney spent 20 minutes presenting the development's legal standing. Everything he said was technically true. None of it addressed what Rachel had said. The gap between the two presentations was, itself, a kind of argument. The commission chair, a 57-year-old man named Robert Hatch, who had been doing this job for 11 years, and who had never once seen 63 people voluntarily attend a planning meeting, called for a recess at 9:30 and looked out at the room with the expression of someone significantly revising their evening's expectations. During the recess, Gerald Cole crossed the room and stopped next to Rachel. Your outline is in their presentation, he said quietly. He was not angry. He was almost something adjacent to impressed. You gave it to the community. I told you what the community needed, Rachel said. The community had the right to say it themselves. Gerald looked at the room at 63 people in folding chairs who had driven here on a Tuesday evening. I'm going to accept the mediation, he said. I'll send the formal agreement by Friday. Rachel nodded. Good, she said. The version we end up building will be substantially different from what I planned, he said. Yes, Rachel said. It will. He looked at her. It might actually be better, he said. And there was something surprised, in a genuine surprise, from a man who had not expected to say that and meant it anyway. Rachel looked at him with the same expression she'd turned on his son across the gathering space. Patience settled. It will be, she said. That's not a consolation. That's just true. Gerald Cole nodded once briefly and went back across the room to his attorney. Victor Reyes, sitting 4 rows back, watched this exchange. He leaned over to the writer beside him and said, quietly, 14 years. She still surprises me. The rider beside him, a woman named Elena who had known Rachel nearly as long, said if she stopped surprising you, she'd be doing it wrong. The recess ended and the commission reconvened, and the meeting went until 11:15, and nothing was resolved that evening. These things never resolve in one evening. That was not how the process worked, but something shifted in the room that had the quality of permanence. The access road stayed clear. The youth program continued on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And on the first Tuesday, after the Planning Commission meeting, Mason Cole showed up at the meeting hall on Clement Street in work clothes, 15 minutes early, and stood at the entrance until the program coordinator, a young woman named Bess, who had been running the logistics for 2 years, looked at him and said, "You the new volunteer?" "Yes," Mason said. Bess looked him up and down with the frank evaluation of someone who had been working with at-risk kids long enough to identify quickly whether a new adult would be useful or decorative. "You know anything about motorcycles?" she said. "Some," Mason said. "I know more about discipline." "The kids will test that," Bess said. "I'm counting on it," Mason said. Bess looked at him for another moment, decided something, and opened the door wider. "Come on in," she said. And Mason Cole walked through the door into the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet, something earned rather than inherited, something real rather than performed, something that was going to be slower and harder and more necessary than any competition he had ever entered. The door closed behind him. Outside, Red Valley continued its evening, the desert cooling at the edges, the sound of a motorcycle somewhere on the highway, 2 miles out, Pete Delgado's restored Sportster running clean and steady on a Sunday test ride. The road opened all the way to the horizon. The first Tuesday session nearly broke Mason before it started. He had walked through that door expecting to teach. That was the frame he'd built in his head on the drive. Over he was coming with something to offer. Discipline from experience, the vocabulary of someone who had trained hard and knew what structure felt like from the inside. He had something real to contribute. That was how he'd sold it to himself. Bess disabused him of this within approximately 4 minutes. "You're not teaching anything tonight," she said, handing him a clipboard. "Tonight you're observing. You watch, you listen. You don't correct unless I tell you to correct. And you definitely don't tell any of these kids how you used to train or what you've won. They don't care, and it'll make them trust you less." She paused. "Questions?" Mason looked at the clipboard. It had a sign-in sheet and a behavior log. "No," he said. "Good." She moved toward the door to the main room. "One more thing. There's a kid named Jerome, 14. He's going to test you within the first 10 minutes because that's what he does with every new adult in this room. Don't take the bait and don't back down either. There's a specific line and you'll know when you find it." "What do I do when I find it?" Mason said. Bess looked at him over her shoulder. "Hold it," she said. "Just hold it. Don't punish, don't lecture, don't reward. Just hold the line and stay calm. That's what he needs to see." She pushed through the door. Mason followed her, and the room hit him 12 kids between the ages of 11 and 16. The specific energy of young people who have learned, through experience, not to extend trust automatically, who assess new adults the way soldiers assess new terrain, looking for weaknesses and exits and the distance between what an adult says and what they do. Jerome found him in 4 minutes, not 10. Jerome was 14 and built with the particular lean strength of a kid whose body was working hard on behalf of an engine that hadn't fully arrived at yet. He looked at Mason the way Mason had seen people look at him before the measuring look, the calculation of threat and opportunity, and then he said, "You're the black belt guy." "I am," Mason said. "You lost," Jerome said. "Not mean, just factual. The way a kid states a thing when they want to see what an adult does with the truth." Mason held the line. "I did," he said. Jerome waited for the qualification, the explanation, the reframing. It didn't come. "To a woman," Jerome added. "Still factual. Still testing." "To someone who was better than me," Mason said. "Yes." Jerome stared at him. "Why are you here?" Jerome said. "Because she told me this program existed," Mason said. "And I thought being here was more useful than being somewhere else." "She told you to come here?" "She told me it existed. I chose to come." Mason paused. There's a difference. Jerome looked at him for another long moment. Then he went back to what he'd been doing, working on a strip bolt on a training engine with more aggression than technique. Mason watched him for a moment, checked the impulse to correct the technique, and moved to the next station. Bess caught his eye from across the room and gave him a very small nod. He had passed the first test without knowing the rules. That felt obscurely like the most important thing he'd done in months. Word of Mason's presence at the youth program reached Rachel through Danny, who heard it from Bess, who texted him Wednesday morning with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has been in the people business long enough to recognize when something genuine has walked through their door. She said he stayed the whole session, Danny told Rachel. She said he asked good questions at the end. She said Jerome tried to get a rise out of him 3 different times, and he held every time. Rachel was eating breakfast. She continued eating. Good, she said. That's all you've got? Good? What would you prefer? Danny sat across from her and put down his phone. I'd prefer you to acknowledge that the guy who grabbed my collar and challenged you in front of the whole town is now volunteering at a kids program because you redirect, which is Rachel, that's not a small thing. No, she said. It's not so. She looked at him. So I hope he comes back Thursday, she said. That's what matters. Anyone can show up once. The work is in the returning. Danny shook his head slowly, not disagreement. More the expression of someone who loves a person and has accepted that they will never fully comprehend them. You're going to check on him, aren't you? He said, quietly, without him knowing. Rachel finished her breakfast. I'm going to know if he comes back Thursday, she said. Yes. He came back Thursday and the Tuesday after that, and the Thursday after that one. 2 weeks into Mason's attendance at the program, something shifted with Jerome. It happened during the mechanics session, the part of the program Rachel had designed herself, where kids learned basic engine work, not because they necessarily use it professionally, but because working with your hands on something mechanical teaches a particular kind of patience that translates. You cannot rush a carburetor. You cannot charm it or intimidate it or post a video about it. You bring the right tool, you apply the right pressure, and you wait for the correct result. The engine doesn't care about your feelings. The engine only responds to what you actually do. Jerome had been fighting the training engine for 3 sessions. He was smart enough to understand the theory and impatient enough to keep skipping steps, which meant he kept arriving at results that didn't work and having to go back to the beginning, which made him angrier, which made him skip more steps. Mason watched this cycle for 20 minutes on a Tuesday evening, and then he did something that surprised himself. He didn't offer help. He sat down on the floor next to Jerome's station on the floor because Jerome was on the floor working on the engine at ground level, and he said, "Can I watch?" Jerome looked at him sideways. "It's a free country," Jerome said. Mason watched. Jerome worked 3 minutes of silence. Then Jerome made the step skip mistake again, and the result was wrong again, and Jerome's jaw tightened and his hands went still. "I hate this," Jerome said. Not to Mason, to the engine. "I know," Mason said. Jerome looked at him. "You don't know," Jerome said. "I skipped steps my whole life," Mason said. "Not in mechanics. In other things. And I kept getting results that didn't work and having to start over, and I kept thinking the problem was the thing I was working on instead of the steps I was skipping." Jerome stared at him. "Did you figure out the steps?" Jerome said. "Still figuring," Mason said. "That's why I'm here." Jerome looked at the engine for a long moment. "Show me the step I'm skipping," Jerome said. And Mason did. Not by taking over, by pointing, describing, letting Jerome's hands do the work. It took 11 minutes. When the components seated correctly, Jerome made a sound that was not quite a word, an involuntary sound of physical satisfaction. The kind a person makes when their body knows something worked before their brain has caught up. Then he looked at Mason with a very different expression than any he'd worn for the previous 2 sessions. "Why didn't you just show me from the beginning?" Jerome said. "Because you weren't ready to be shown," Mason said. "You needed to fight it first." Jerome turned this over. "That's how people are," he said. "Most people," Mason said. me especially. What Mason was not telling Jerome, or Bess, or anyone in Red Valley except, slowly and imperfectly, Kyle, who had stayed in town because he said he was taking time off training, and who everyone, including Mason, understood was staying because he wanted to see how this story ended, was what was happening to him internally during this period. The Fighting Academy had called twice. His coach, a man named Rourke, who had trained him for 6 years and had a genuine investment in Mason's competitive future, called and said, "I don't know what's happening there, but I need you to think about whether walking away from competition is what you actually want or whether it's a reaction." "I'm not walking away from competition," Mason said. "I'm just not competing right now." "Those sound like the same thing," Rourke said. "They're not," Mason said. "Walking away is a decision. Not competing right now is I'm trying to understand what I'm competing for. And until I understand that, I don't want to be in front of judges." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "You sound different," he said. "I am different," Mason said. "A little." "Is it the woman? The fight?" Mason thought about how to answer that honestly. "It's what the fight showed me about everything that came before it," he said. The fight was 10 seconds of clarity about 6 years of, he paused, of doing the right thing for the wrong reason. Rourke processed this. "That's a profound reaction to losing," Rourke said. "I didn't just lose," Mason said. "She handed me back to myself. I'm trying to figure out what to do with the return." Rourke said he'd call again in 2 weeks. Mason said that was fine. He hung up and sat with the conversation and felt, underneath the discomfort of change, something that was almost spacious. A quality of room that hadn't been there before, like a fist unclenching. The mediation between Gerald Cole and the Red Valley Community Organization happened on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the Planning Commission meeting, in the conference room of the county building, 30 miles from Red Valley, because the neutral mediator, a woman named Andrea Kloss, who came recommended by the State Planning Board and who operated with the particular low-heat efficiency of someone who had seen every version of this conflict before, had determined that neutral ground was necessary and county building was as neutral as available. Rachel attended with Dave Ritter and a woman named Carol Bright, who had been running the Eastern Merchants Association for 9 years and who arrived with a binder 3 inches thick and the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right room. Look. Gerald Cole arrived with his attorney and his development firm representative and the particular composure of a man who had decided that composure was his best remaining asset. The session lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Andrea Kloss ran it with the precision of a surgeon cutting through position to interest, moving past stated demands to underlying needs, identifying the 2 or 3 places where the gap between the party was real and the 10 or 12 places where it was performance. The moment that shifted, everything came at the 2-hour mark. Gerald Cole's development firm representative, a man named Patterson, who wore expensive shoes and had the specific energy of someone paid to represent a position rather than hold it, said something about community impact assessments being, and he used this word, discretionary, and on context of the proposed timeline. Carol Bright opened her 3-inch binder. What came out of that binder over the next 40 minutes was documented, specific and comprehensive in the way that only 9 years of careful record-keeping produces. She had attendance figures for every community event held on the land in question going back 7 years. She had statements from 12 business owners about customer access patterns and revenue correlation with the access road. She had 3 independent assessments of the economic impact of the proposed development on Eastern Side merchants, commissioned by the Merchants Association at their own expense. Patterson looked at the binder and said quietly to Gerald, "We didn't know about the Merchants Association documentation." "I told you about it," Gerald said. His voice was even. "You said there was community organization. You didn't say." "I said Rachel Morgan had been in this town for 4 years," Gerald said. "I should have been more specific about what 4 years means." Andrea Kloss watched this exchange with the contained satisfaction of a mediator who has just watched a negotiation arrive at its real starting point. "Perhaps," she said, "we should take a short break and then return to the timeline question with the full documentation in view. They took a break. During the break, Gerald Cole walked to the window of the conference room and stood looking out for a moment. Rachel was near the door with Dave and Carol. She was not watching Gerald. She was listening to Carol, who was saying something about the binder organization, pointing at sections. Gerald turned from the window. "Miss Morgan," he said. Rachel looked at him. "You've been building this for 4 years," he said. "The documentation, the community organization, the relationships." He was not accusatory. He was again something adjacent to genuine. "You came here 4 years ago, and you started doing the work of a person who intended to be here when something like this happened." Rachel looked at him steadily. "I came here 4 years ago," she said, "and I started doing the work of a person who intended to be here. Full stop. The rest is what communities do when someone does that work." Gerald looked at her for a long moment. "My son is still at the youth program," he said. "I know. He called me last week." Something moved in Gerald's face, carefully controlled, but present. "He told me about a boy named Jerome," he said. Gerald stopped. Started again. He said teaching someone to stop skipping steps was the most useful thing he'd done in years. Rachel said nothing. "I've been thinking about that," Gerald said. "About what steps I've been skipping." It was the most honest thing Rachel had heard from Gerald Cole. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. "The mediation is a start," she said. "The development that comes out of it is a step. What you do with this town after the building is finished, that's the long work." "I'm not accustomed to long work," Gerald said. "I'm accustomed to transactions." "I know," Rachel said. "That's the step you're skipping." Gerald Cole looked at her with an expression that was more complex than anything he'd worn in their previous encounters, stripped of strategy, stripped of assessment, something close to the look his son had worn, standing in the garage doorway in work clothes, asking if he could talk. Like father, like son. Underneath the performance, a person who didn't quite know how to be what they were trying to become. "Okay," Gerald said. "I'll learn." Andrea Kloss appeared at the door of the conference room. "Whenever you're ready," she said. They went back inside. The mediation produced a revised development framework that was, as Gerald had predicted and Rachel had confirmed, substantially different from his original plan. The Eastern Access Road was permanently designated as shared use infrastructure, protected from obstruction by a formal easement. 2 of the 3 parcels would be developed with commercial use that required community impact assessment and planning commission approval at each phase. The 3rd parcel, the one that contained the land used by the community programs and the motorcycle gathering, was placed under a long-term lease agreement with the Red Valley Community Organization at nominal cost, reviewable every 5 years. It was not everything the community had wanted. It was considerably more than Gerald Cole had intended to give. It was, in Andrea Kloss's professional assessment, which she delivered to both parties before closing the session, a workable agreement that had a reasonable chance of producing something the town could live with. Carol Bright drove back to Red Valley with the framework document in her binder and cried for about 10 minutes on the County Road, alone in her car, because 9 years is a long time to keep records, and she had not been entirely sure until today that the records would ever matter. Dave Ritter called his son from the parking lot and said, "You should have been there." It was something. Rachel drove back alone. She did not call anyone. She drove and thought and let the weight of the afternoon sit in the car with her, not heavily, not triumphantly, but with the particular quality of something that has been worth doing. She called Victor from the road. "It's done," she said. "The framework's signed." "Good," Victor said. "It's not perfect," she said. "Nothing is," he said. "The lease on the 3rd parcel is what matters," she said. "The program land is protected for at least 5 years. Long enough to build something permanent," Victor said. "That's the plan," she said. They talked for a few minutes about logistics, the next regional gathering, some organizational matters she'd been consulting on from a distance. The quiet maintenance work of a network that functions because someone tends it consistently. When she hung up, she felt the specific rightness of a day that had accomplished what it set out to accomplish, not more and not less. The twist that Rachel had not seen coming arrived that same evening, and it arrived through Danny. Annis, she was back at the garage working late because a bike needed to go out the next morning when Danny came in with his phone and an expression that she had not seen on his face before. Not worried, not excited. Something between the two that had no clean name. "You need to see this," he said. He handed her the phone. It was a social media post, not from someone in Red Valley. From a woman in Las Vegas named Tanya Shields, who had 200,000 followers and who wrote about women in non-traditional industries and communities. Tanya Shields had seen the video from the gathering, had done her own research, had found court records and community organization documents, and somehow Rachel did not know how, but somehow had connected Rachel Morgan, mechanic of Red Valley, to the leadership history of the Devil's Compass crew. The post was not tabloid. It was not exploitative. It was the kind of writing that emerges when a skilled person is genuinely moved by something and wants other people to understand why. It said, "There's a woman in Arizona who walked away from a life most people would never have the courage to enter and built something most people never have the patience to build. She didn't announce it. She didn't explain it. She just did it. And when someone tried to take it from her, she showed them something they'll spend years understanding." The post had 60,000 likes. Rachel handed the phone back. Danny watched her. "Say something," he said. "What would you like me to say?" she said. "Tell me how you feel," Danny said. "Not what you're going to do about it. How you feel." Rachel looked at her brother. She thought about the question honestly. "Exposed," she said, and she paused, grateful. "In that order. Exposed because of the history?" Danny said. "Because the quiet was a choice," Rachel said. "A deliberate one. And choices like that have a shelf life. They last until something or someone makes them visible." She picked up her tools. "I knew this was possible. I knew from the moment I agreed to the challenge that making it public changed things. I made that calculation." "Did you calculate Tanya Shields?" Danny said. "No," Rachel said. "I didn't calculate Tanya Shields." Danny looked at her for a moment. "Are you scared?" he said. The same question he'd asked the night before the gathering. Rachel thought about it the same way she had then. Honestly. "Not of being seen," she said. "Of what being seen asks of you. Once people know who you are, actually know, you can't choose anonymity anymore. You just choose what to do with being known." Danny nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" he said. Rachel set down her tools. She thought about Mason Cole sitting on the floor next to Jerome. She thought about Carol Bright's 3-inch binder and the 10 minutes of tears on the county road that she didn't know about yet, but would understand if she did. She thought about Gerald Cole at the conference room window saying, "I'll learn," with the specific vulnerability of a man who meant it and didn't know if he was capable of it. She thought about Victor's hand on her shoulder at the gathering and 14 years of trust built from the kind of actions that don't photograph well but hold everything together. She thought about Pete Delgado's Sportster running clean on a Sunday morning toward a grave 40 miles away. "I'm going to finish this bike," she said, "and then I'm going to sleep. And tomorrow I'm going to open the garage, and whoever shows up, shows up." She picked her tools back up. "And Danny," she said. "Yeah?" "The program needs a social media presence," she said. "Nothing big. Just something that shows what we're doing there. If people are going to look at us anyway, they should see the right things." Danny stared at her. "You want me to run the program's social media?" he said. "You're studying business," she said. "Community marketing is business." "Yes." Danny looked at his phone, then at her, then at the bike she was working on. "Okay," he said. He went home. Rachel worked until midnight, and the bike was done, and she slept well because she had a clean conscience, the same as she always did, and because the day had been full of the kind of thing that fills a life properly, not trophies, not applause, not the performance of significance, but the slow, real accumulation of actions taken carefully in the direction of what matters. And in a hotel room across town, Gerald Cole sat at his desk and opened his laptop and looked at the mediation framework he had signed his name to. And he thought about the word transaction and what it meant and what its opposite was. And he did not find the answer that night But the fact that he was looking for it was itself a kind of beginning. And in the garage on Clement Street, Jerome sat with three other kids long after the Tuesday session had officially ended, working on the training engine with the focused patience of someone who has recently discovered that not skipping steps produces a result that is worth the wait, asking questions of the air that no one answered because the adult who had shown him the step had gone home, which meant Jerome had to find the next step himself, which was exactly the point and which Jerome was beginning slowly to understand. Part 5 Louis, Viet 5000 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, Pea hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liên mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quang đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện mỹ hoặc hy vọng vận dấu cảm xúc, chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 5 đạt điểm 10-10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện 9. Sier Theo ngồi thứ ba, judo kick, ting công Viet Lan man, kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh, để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng trọn vẹn, lưu ý trả lời trong một tin nhắn, không nhảy sang một document. Mỗi 2-3 phút cần có mini climax và đạt 10-15 mini climax mỗi phần. Cứ 10-12 phút có one twist lần sâu sắc, dan zen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn. Thăng tinh tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính. Thực tế và gần gũi, mỗi 8-10 phút cần có mặc dù chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhau. The Tanya Shields post did not fade the way Rachel had expected it to. Most things on the internet had a natural arc, a spike, a plateau, a decline, the comfortable return to obscurity. Rachel had counted on that arc. She had factored it into her, thinking the night Danny showed her the phone, had made her peace with the exposure on the assumption that exposure was temporary and the quiet life she'd built was more durable than a viral moment. She had miscalculated. By the following Monday, 3 more writers had picked up the story. Not tabloid accounts, something more careful, and therefore more lasting. A journalist from Phoenix wrote a long piece about the Devil's Compass and its role in Southwest community protection over the prior decade, and Rachel Morgan was in the piece not as a headline but as a thread running through it, named in 7 different contexts across 11 years, each one a moment where something had been protected or corrected or quietly resolved. The piece was accurate. Rachel had not spoken to the journalist. The journalist had found court records, incident reports, community organization documents, and people who were willing to talk about what they'd seen. The people who were willing to talk were not members of the organization. They were community members. People in 3 counties who had been in rooms where Rachel Morgan had done something useful and who, when a journalist asked them what they remembered it clearly and with the specific warmth of people recounting something that had mattered to them personally. That was the part Rachel had not calculated. She had expected her motorcycle network to hold its silence, and it did. What she had not expected was that the communities around that network would speak, because communities remember when someone shows up for them, and they do not consider that memory to be a secret. Carmen Reyes called her Monday morning. "You've seen the Phoenix piece," Carmen said. "I've seen it," Rachel said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." Rachel, Carmen, "I'm fine." Her voice was steady but not dismissive. "It's accurate. That's the main thing. I've been in situations where inaccurate things were written, and this is not that. The facts are correct. The facts being that you were one of the most significant operational leaders in the Southwest Hells Angels network for 7 years," Carmen said. "Not accusatory. Processing. The facts being that I helped communities address problems that other processes hadn't addressed," Rachel said. "The organizational context is accurate. What that context means is more complicated." Carmen was quiet for a moment. "I ran your record 4 weeks ago," she said. "I know you've never been charged with anything." "I know you know," Rachel said. "I didn't ask then. I'm asking now." Carmen paused. "Is there anything I should know? Anything that changes what I understand about you and this town?" Rachel thought about this question with the seriousness it deserved. No, she said, nothing changes. The garage is real. The program is real. The community organization is real. 4 years of showing up is real. The only thing that's changed is that more people know the context I came from. She paused. The context doesn't change the 4 years. Carmen let out a breath. No, she said quietly. It doesn't. Another pause. Some people in town are going to have questions. I know. How do you want to handle it? Rachel set down the wrench she'd been holding. Same way I handle everything, she said. Directly. Anyone who wants to ask me something can ask me. I won't lie and I won't over-explain. What I did before Red Valley was what I did. What I've done here is what I've done here. People can decide what they think. Carmen thought about this. You know, most of them already decided, Carmen said. 4 years ago. Rachel picked her wrench back up. I know, she said. The town meeting happened on Wednesday evening, and nobody had officially called it. That was the thing about Red Valley. It was small enough that when enough people needed to be in the same room, the room materialized without formal arrangement. The diner on Main had a back room that held 40 people at tables, and by 6:30 on Wednesday, there were 38 people in it, and the owner had made coffee for everyone without being asked. Rachel had not called this meeting. She had not known about it until Danny texted her at 6:15 to say that people were gathering and she probably should be there. She walked in at 6:35. The room went quiet when she entered, not the hostile quiet of a confrontation, but the particular hush of a group of people who have been talking about someone and have suddenly run out of time to decide what to say to them. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the faces. Pete Delgado, Dave Ritter, Carol Bright, Sandra from the food vendor, Margaret the retired school teacher, Dolores from the flower shop, Patricia with the military background, Deputy Carmen Reyes in civilian clothes, off-duty, coffee in hand, Bess from the youth program, a dozen others whose names she knew and whose cars she'd seen in her parking lot over 4 years, whose children she'd watched grow, whose problems she'd heard about in the plastic chairs near her workbench. I'm not going to make a speech, Rachel said. If you have questions, ask them. I'll answer what I can answer honestly and tell you when I can't answer something and why. Silence for a moment. Then Pete Delgado said, from the second table, in the comfortable voice of a man who has survived enough to not waste time on preamble, did you fix my carburetor the same way you would have if you'd known anyone was watching? Rachel looked at him. Yes, she said. Pete nodded. That's all I needed. He picked up his coffee. That small exchange broke something open in the room, and the questions came after it naturally. The way questions come when people have been given permission to ask. Dave Ritter asked whether the development mediation had been influenced by her organizational connections or whether it had been purely community organizing. She said both, and neither, that the community organizing was the organizing, and that her background meant she understood how to build it, and that the two things were not separate, but the outcome belonged to the community, not to the devil's compass. Carol Bright asked whether there was anything Rachel had done in the years before Red Valley that she regretted. The room went very still at that one. Rachel thought about it for long enough that people could see she was thinking about it honestly. Yes, she said. Specific things. Moments where I had options and I chose an option that was faster rather than better. I live with those. She paused. They're part of why I'm here. Part of why I chose this instead of continuing what I was doing. Carol held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. Margaret, the retired school teacher, asked, did you know when you came here that you were going to build what you've built? The program, the organization, the community presence. Was it planned? Rachel almost smiled. The garage was planned, she said. Everything else followed from doing the work honestly. She paused. I think that's how it usually works. There were more questions. Some practical, some personal, some that were really statements of support, dressed as questions, which Rachel recognized and accepted without calling attention to. The meeting lasted an hour and 20 minutes, and when it ended, 38 people left knowing more about Rachel Morgan than they had before, and not one of them had changed what they fundamentally thought of her. Because what they fundamentally thought of her was built from 4 years of direct experience, and direct experience is a more durable foundation than any revelation. Dolores from the flower shop stopped her near the door and took both of her hands and said, "I don't care what you did before. You showed up for this town. That's what counts." Rachel squeezed her hands. "Thank you, Dolores," she said. "Don't thank me," Dolores said. "Thank whoever it was that sent you here. Because we needed you before we knew we needed you, and that's the best kind of help." Rachel walked home with Danny, and they didn't talk much because there wasn't much that needed saying. Danny had his hands in his pockets and occasionally looked at her sideways with the expression of someone watching a person they love navigate something they can't help with, which is one of the harder positions a younger sibling occupies, and he occupied it well, walking beside her, present, not pushing. "You okay?" he said finally. "1 block from home." "Yeah," she said. "The real kind of okay, or the Rachel kind of okay?" She looked at him. "What's the Rachel kind?" she said. "Where you're okay, but it costs something, and you're not going to tell me what it cost." She thought about that. "Maybe both," she said. He nodded and let it go. That was the Danny kind of love. 3 days after the town meeting, the twist that Rachel genuinely had not seen coming arrived, and this time it did not come through a phone screen. It came through the door of her garage, and the person who came through it was a woman Rachel had not seen in 6 years. Her name was Diana Marsh. She was 51 years old, and she had been Rachel's predecessor as crew leader of the Devil's Compass before Rachel had taken over. And she had left the organization under circumstances that were complicated and painful, and that Rachel had never fully discussed with anyone, including Victor. Diana had not aged so much as clarified she was leaner, quieter in her physicality, with the specific quality of a person who has done a significant amount of interior work and arrived somewhere more settled than where they started. She stood in the doorway of the garage and looked at Rachel. Rachel set down what she was holding. "Diana," she said. "I saw the piece," Diana said. "The Phoenix article." "I know. I drove 4 hours." "I know," Rachel said again. Diana walked in. She didn't look around the shop, she looked at Rachel. The way people look when they've driven 4 hours to see a person in the shop is irrelevant. "You built something real here," Diana said. "I tried to." "You did." Diana stopped about 6 feet away, the same distance. Rachel noticed with a distant awareness that she had stopped for Mason Cole in the gravel lot 2 months ago. "I drove 4 hours because the article put your name attached to things I didn't know you'd done. And some of them were things I should have done and didn't before I left." Rachel was very still. "You didn't leave under conditions that made that easy," Rachel said carefully. "No," Diana said. "But the conditions didn't absolve me. I've been working on understanding that." She paused. "I've been living in Tucson. I'm running a legal aid organization. Women's Services. I've been doing it for 4 years. Rachel looked at her. 4 years, she said. "About the same time you came here," Diana said. And something in both of their faces acknowledged the parallel without requiring a speech about it. 2 women who had walked away from the same thing at roughly the same time and built something in the space the walking away created. "Why are you here, Diana?" Rachel said. "Really?" Diana met her eyes. "Because the legal aid organization is expanding," she said. "And I want to propose a formal partnership with the community program here. Resources, legal support for community members, connections to the network I've built in Tucson." She paused. "And because I owe you an apology for how things ended before I left. And I wanted to give it in person." The garage was very quiet. Rachel looked at Diana for a long moment with the particular attention of someone reading a situation at multiple levels, simultaneously assessing, remembering, feeling the weight of 6 years and what those years had contained. "The apology first," Rachel said. Diana delivered it. It was specific, which meant it was real. She named the decisions she'd made, the moments where her choices had made Rachel's position harder, the things she'd said in the final months that had been unfair and that she had known were unfair at the time. She did not explain them away. She stated them and said she was sorry and held Rachel's gaze throughout. Rachel listened, She did not soften it or interrupt. When Diana finished, Rachel said, "Accepted." Just like that, Diana said. "What would you like me to add?" Rachel said. Diana almost smiled. "Nothing. I've just some apologies get complicated." "This one doesn't," Rachel said. "You did the work before you walked in. The apology is a result of that work, not a shortcut past it. I can tell the difference." She picked up the folder on the workbench. "Now, tell me about the legal aid expansion," Diana told her. It was good. Better than good. It was the kind of structural support that the community program had needed for 2 years, and that Rachel had known they needed and had been building towards slowly, because she hadn't had the connections in the legal space that Diana had apparently spent 4 years building in Tucson. The partnership would mean that families in Red Valley who needed legal advice on housing, employment, community rights, the kinds of things that people in small towns often couldn't afford to navigate would have access to real support, not referrals to distant agencies, actual, proximate, accessible help. "Yes," Rachel said when Diana finished. "You don't want to think about it?" Diana said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 years," Rachel said. "I didn't know I was thinking about it in the form of you. But the need is the same either way." She set down the folder. "When can you start?" Diana looked at her. 3 weeks, she said. "I need to set the structure on the Tucson end before I split my attention." 3 weeks, Rachel said. "Good." They talked for another hour logistics, structure, the practical specifics of two capable people who have done things before and know how to plan them honestly. By the time Diana left, the afternoon light had shifted, and Danny had come and gone twice without interrupting. Because he had looked through the doorway once, recognized the quality of the conversation from the body language alone, and gone back to what he was doing with the particular wisdom of someone who knows when his presence is not needed. When Diana's car pulled out of the lot, Rachel stood in the doorway for a moment. 6 years, 4 hours, one apology and one real conversation. Some things closed. The youth program's first public showcase happened 6 weeks later. Bess had organized it, or rather, Bess had permitted it to organize itself, which was her method. She identified when something had enough momentum to be shown, and she opened the door and stood back. The kids had been working on a project for 4 weeks, taking a donated engine from a 1,991 motorcycle that had come in as scrap and rebuilding it from component parts to functional operation. It was Jerome's project. Not only his, he had worked with 4 other kids, assigning roles, managing the timeline, running into the same step-skipping problem from the other side now, as the person responsible for getting other people not to skip steps, which was its own education. He had come to Mason 3 times in those 4 weeks, with specific questions about managing the group's impatience, and Mason had answered the questions by telling Jerome what he himself had learned, which made the answers more useful than any theory would have been. The showcase was in the meeting hall on Clement Street. 30 people came. Pete Delgado was there, in the plastic chair that someone had apparently learned to reserve for him. Dave Ritter, Carol Bright, Victor Reyes, and 2 other riders from the regional group who had been in the area. Tanya Shields had driven from Las Vegas. Nobody had formally invited her. She had simply heard about it through the community organization's social media presence that Danny had been running for 6 weeks, and she had driven. Gerald Cole came. He came alone. No attorney, no representative, no assistant. He sat in the back row and looked at the room with the expression of a man who is learning something about what a room can contain. Mason saw him come in. They made eye contact briefly across the hall. Gerald gave his son a small nod, not congratulatory, not warm in any performed way. Just present. Just a father seeing his son in a room doing something real. Mason nodded back. That was enough. Jerome stood in front of 30 people and explained what they had done. He was not polished. He did not have the language of someone trained to present. He lost his thread twice and found it again, both times, by going back to the specific thing in front of him, the engine on the work table, the actual object, the thing they had actually done, which was the right instinct and which he had found in his own. He explained the process. He explained the steps they had not skipped. He explained what had happened when Marcus had tried to skip the crankshaft assembly step and they'd had to go back to the beginning. And he used words about that experience that were not polished, but were completely, unmistakably real. He said, somebody told me that most people skip steps their whole life and think the problem is the thing they're working on instead of the steps they're skipping. I thought about that a lot. I think it's true for more than engines. He looked at Mason when he said it. Mason held the look. Something passed between them that had no name and did not need one. Then Jerome and Marcus and the three other kids started the engine. The room heard it catch, heard it run rough for the first 3 seconds, then settling into the even, steady sound of a thing that has been put together correctly and is now doing what it was meant to do. The 30 people in that room made the sound that people make when something works. Not applause, not immediately just that involuntary collective exhale of witnessing something function that wasn't functioning before. Then Pete Delgado started clapping. At 73 years old, Pete's clapping had the specific quality of someone who knew what things were worth and chose to mark them accordingly. Everyone followed. Tanya Shields caught Rachel after the showcase near the door and introduced herself with the directness of someone who has built an audience by being direct about things. I want to write about the program, she said, properly. Not the viral angle, the actual work. Rachel looked at her. The kids' privacy comes first, Rachel said. Agreed, Tanya said. Full consent process, guardian sign-off. Anything you need. The story is the program's story, Rachel said. Not mine, I know, Tanya said. I figured that out from watching tonight. She paused. Can I ask you something? Off the record. Rachel looked at her. The fight, Tanya said. When you agreed to it, did you know it was going to become what it became? The video, the piece, all of it? Did you calculate that? Rachel thought about it honestly. No, she said. Then what were you calculating? Tanya said. Rachel was quiet for a moment. I was calculating that my brother needed someone to stand up for him, she said, and that Mason Cole needed to meet someone he couldn't move, and that the town needed to see both of those things happen in public. She paused. I wasn't calculating beyond that. Everything after was people responding to something real. I can't take credit for the response. Tanya looked at her. Most people would take the credit, she said. Most people need it, Rachel said. Tanya Shields had written about 1,000 people over the course of her career. She prided herself on the ability to identify the thing underneath what people said the actual operating system, the true motivation running below the stated one. She was looking for it now with Rachel, and what she was finding was something she had not encountered in quite this form before. There was no gap. What Rachel said and what Rachel was, there was no space between them. No performance layer, no managed presentation, no cultivated image. Just a person who had done the work so long and so consistently that the work had become the person, or perhaps the person had always been this, and the work was simply where you could see it clearly. Tanya wrote the piece 3 weeks later, and it was the best thing she had written in 2 years, and she knew it the moment she finished it at 2 a.m. with the specific certainty that comes when a piece of writing has told the truth about something. The last conversation of the season happened on a Sunday morning in October, 6 weeks after the showcase, in the garage. Pete Delgado had come for a routine check on the Sportster, the kind of check he didn't really need to come in for. The kind he came in for because the garage was where he went to sit in the plastic chair and talk to someone who listened. Mason Cole had come because he'd been stopping by sporadically over the past month. The way people stop by places where something has happened to them that they're still processing. He was not there for a bike. He didn't have a bike in yet. Though Danny had been quietly suggesting he should get one, that it would make sense given how much time he was spending in a motorcycle community. He was there because he was there. He had stopped needing reasons for it. The three of them were in the garage, Pete in his chair, Mason on the workbench edge, Rachel under the truck she was servicing, when Pete said something that had the quality of a thing he'd been holding for a while. You know what the difference is, Pete said, between being feared and being respected. Nobody had asked the question. Pete had simply decided it was time. Rachel said from under the truck, "Tell me, feared is what you are when people don't have a choice," Pete said. "Respected is what you are when they do. When they could walk away and they don't." He paused. "I come here every week. I don't have to. My grandson could drive me to any shop in the county. But I come here." He let that sit. "That's respect. I choose it." Silence for a moment. "That's what she said to me. After the fight. She said fear disappears when people stop being afraid. Respect stays." "She's right," Pete said. From under the truck, without looking up, "I'm right. Occasionally." "Occasionally," Pete said agreeably. Mason looked at his hands. They were different hands now than they'd been 2 months ago, not physically, but in what he thought of when he looked at them. 2 months ago, he'd looked at his hands and thought about what they could do to someone. Now he thought about what they'd done for Jerome's engine, the way Jerome's face had looked when the component seated correctly. "I'm going back to training," Mason said. The garage was quiet. "When did you decide?" Rachel said from under the truck. "Just now," Mason said, saying it out loud, I think. He paused. "Not competition, not yet. Maybe not at all. Just training." Because training with something to actually think about is different from training to win. Rachel slid out from under the truck. She sat up on the creeper and looked at him. "What are you going to think about?" she said. "Jerome," Mason said. "The step he's going to skip next week that I need to see coming." He paused. "Whether the program is getting the support it needs from the Diana Marsh partnership. Whether there are other kids like Jerome who aren't in the program yet." He paused again. "Whether my father is actually learning anything or just performing learning, and what I can do about the difference." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. "That's a lot to think about," she said. "It's enough," he said. "For now it's enough." Pete Delgado finished his coffee. He set the cup on the workbench and straightened up from his chair with the specific, deliberate care of a 73-year-old body that has made peace with what it costs to move. "Steve, Sunday drive," he said. "Sportster's ready?" "Sportster's ready," Rachel said. Pete picked up his keys. "See you next week," he said. He walked out. They heard the engine start clean, even steady. They heard it move away. They sat in the quiet it left behind. Mason looked at Rachel. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been asking me things for 2 months, she said. "You don't need permission." "The night before the fight," he said, "you told Danny the work is in the returning, that anyone can show up once." He paused. "Did you know I'd come back?" After the gathering, Rachel picked up her tools. She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about everything. "I hoped," she said. "I don't know with anyone, in advance. I do the thing that creates the possibility. And then I find out." "What if I hadn't come back?" he said. "Then you wouldn't have," she said. "And I'd have hoped for the next person." Mason sat with that. "That's a hard way to live," he said. "It's the only way I know to live honestly," she said. She went back under the truck. "Hand me the wrench." The 14 mm. He found it on the workbench. Handed it down. She took it without looking. "Mason," she said, from under the truck. "Yeah, you came back," she said. "That matters. Don't spend too much time on what you might have done. Spend it on what you're doing." He sat on the edge of the workbench and looked at the ceiling of the garage and felt the full weight of 2 months pressing through him, not heavily now, but with the particular dense quality of lived experience, of time that had actually meant something, of a version of himself that was more real than the version he'd arrived with. Outside, the desert moved into its October hector cooler at the edges, the light a different angle, the sky a shade deeper than August. The access road was open. The program was running. Jerome was learning not to skip steps. Gerald Cole was, slowly and imperfectly, learning the difference between a transaction and a commitment. Diana Marsh was building something in Tucson that would reach Red Valley in 3 weeks. Victor Reyes was somewhere on a desert highway, riding because riding was itself enough. Pete Delgado was 40 miles away, approaching the grave of the woman he had loved for 50 years, on an engine that ran clean because someone had cared enough to rebuild it right. And Rachel Morgan was under a truck in her garage in Red Valley, Arizona, doing the work she had chosen. The way she had always done it precisely, honestly, without audience, without applause, with the complete and unshakable knowledge that this was what strength looked like from the inside. When no one was watching, when there was no crowd and no camera and no version of yourself to perform. This was it. This quiet, this wrench, this engine, this town. This was what she had built when she walked away from everything else, and it was more than enough, and it was entirely hers. And nothing, not a black belt, not a developer's money, not a viral video, not 6 years of distance between two women who had once led the same crew, nothing that had come at it had managed to take a single piece of it away. Because real things, built with real time and real care by a person who is genuinely who they appear to be, do not come apart under pressure. They hold. They simply, completely, and permanently hold.